Mixing music is no different in artistic terms to fine cuisine or ornamental gardening or painting. You have complete freedom to do things, to create something, and it's great, it's fantastic. However, all four of these things have technical know-how that must be in place so that you can circumvent problems and you can essentially have the most high quality saleable product. Now, all four of those things have raw materials, so that being the musicianship and how well things are mic'd up, for example. Same thing with painting. You've got to have the best paints you can get, the best brushes you can get, the best canvases you can get. Nothing else will do when you're trying to get the best possible product. Now, I'm going to talk about the traps in music mixing. Just a few things, but they're the big ones. Now, I've got on here, I'm just going to press record on my computer here on the screen so you can see. I've got a mix here of a tune called Dr. Robert, which is from Revolver by the Beatles. Now, I did this as one of my lockdown tunes with a drummer mate of mine, Ted Carrasco, fantastic player. And he sent his drum recordings back to me so that I could then put all the other parts on and sort of create the tune. Well, he'll make you. So you can hear lots of different things there. There's drums, bass, some guitars, there's a Hammond organ, and lots of backing vocals. Okay, that's fine. How do we mix these? What do we have to think about first? Mixing-wise, there will always be people that say, oh, no, I don't like your mix, there's too much of this, there's too much of that. You've got to kind of put that to one side, really, because this is about the technical aspects of how to make a mix as good as you can get it. Now, if I open up the mixer here, you can see all my channels, a few muted ones, duff takes or things that I decided not to use. And you can see, for example, all my vocals there. There's some drums. Now, at the top row, you can see that lots of the EQs here, lots of the EQ graphs show a bass cut. Why is this? Well, the only things that you should have in a mix that have any bass end on at all are kick drum and bass guitar, or bass synth, whatever you're using there, whether any bass drum or any bass instrument. That's the only time that you can have straight through no bass cut at all. But even then, you've got to worry about rumble, for example, that a mic might pick up. The Ted's kick drum here is actually quite a small drum. I think it's an 18-inch kick drum, so it's quite small. That doesn't mean it's going to be able to really shift the sort of air that a 22-inch bass drum may shift, for example. So we've also got to be a little bit careful that that bass drum punches, but there's nothing below it that can make your speakers do this. And that's what we don't want, because bass is essentially the entire energy of a piece of music. 80% of the energy in a sound wave is below 200 hertz. That's a pretty unfair weighting, really. So bass is very, very powerful and needs to be kept on a tight lead. So my vocal parts, for example, if I just solo those out, you can see that there are no bass cuts on those vocals.
Ring my friend, I said you'd call Dr. Robert.
That's because I've got them bussed together. I've got them mixed together on another fader, which you can see over there.
Robert.
There it is. So I can unsolo these and actually just solo out my vocals all on their own, so you'll hear exactly the same thing.
You'd call Dr. Robert.
Now, as you can see at the top, I've put a bass cut in. There you go, 92 hertz. I've rolled off everything below that. I could go a little bit higher than that, but I don't really need to. This is really the low-end rumble that we're worried about. Everything below about 100 hertz, we've got to be very careful that we don't allow too much of that through, well, anything on other instruments. There's no point in recording full frequency range on a violin part. You've got all of this bass. Now, bass is created simply by ambience in a room or movement of the player or anything like that. So if you put all of those things together, you hear all this sort of rumbling, and you just don't need it. Now, not only do you not need it, it'll create a lot of problems when you're trying to mix your bass drum and bass guitar together, and you're thinking, why is this sounding really terrible? And the answer is you've got 16 other instruments that are also contributing needlessly. So cut all of your bass end off. Now, vocals wise, now this is important for producing vinyl as well. You don't want excessive low end because actually it represents a lot of movement on your record. Some 12-inch singles, they're literally a 5-minute, 6-minute tune. You can have the cut wider, which means you can have more bass, but you've still got to be careful. So I've also put a de-esser on the vocals here. So if I just play the vocal part back, you can see that any sibilance is actually reduced.
Bring my friend, I said you'd call Dr. Robert.
But you don't want to go too draconian with this because you'll end up with a lisp where it really does cut everything off. So what you can actually do is you can specify the reduction to be perhaps a little less.
Said you'd call Dr. Robert.
Now, what this does, a de-esser, is very, very important. When you're dealing with a digital file, it's easy. You just mix down onto something and you listen to it back and go, yeah, it's fine. But when we're dealing with a physical reproduction system, that is a record, for example, when you're dealing with something like that, you've got a diamond cutter and a stylus, and they simply cannot cope with high amounts of treble, like sudden sibilance. So, and this really did manifest itself on the first tune that I worked on that we were recording for vinyl. I had no idea about de-essing, nothing at all. And we listened to the record back, and it was every time there was an S sound, it went. It was absolutely dreadful, and it was unusable. And luckily, it was a test pressing, so we went, "Oh, I'm sorry," and sent another mix pack, and it was fine. We got away with it. Now, when we've got, so we've got some bass cut and we've got some de-essing. Now, the next thing to talk about is phasing. Now, this is really, really important, especially with vinyl, because what it means is essentially two mics. Now, I'm going to listen to the drum overheads now. Listening to the drum overheads will reveal if there's any phasing problems with those mics, in that the sound may sound slightly off to one side or distant, or things get cut out, or there's a distinct lack of bass, or the treble is a bit swishy, all of those sort of things. Now, luckily, Ted knows about all this stuff, so when he sent his overheads to me, they're absolutely fine. So these are just the drum overheads. Now, if I open up what's called a correlation meter on Logic, I have a very boring looking graph which basically shows me whether those signals are in phase or not. And they pretty much are. +1 is extremely in phase, completely in phase. -1 is completely out of phase. You want everything to the right-hand side of the zero line if you possibly can. Now, what I've done with one of my tracks here is I've actually put a sample delay plugin to show you what happens when it's not in phase. Now, let's try 55 samples. That's very small. Now, we've got all sorts of problems there now. So just by introducing a delay, we've created phase cancellations. That is, those mics, and instead of working together, they're working against each other. When one mic is reproducing, or one mic has a positive signal, the other has a negative. +1 plus -1 equals 0. So you start removing stuff. That's not good. It manifests itself more in the bass than it does in the top end. So doing things like putting things out of phase in terms of bass is really not a good idea when you're mixing for anything to do with vinyl, because you're asking one side of the diamond cutter to go that way while you're asking the other side to essentially do something different. You can't do it. And actually what ends up happening is that the stylus can quite easily jump out of the record. You've got to be really careful with this. You've got to give that record lathe, the record cutter, you've got to give them something that they can use. And actually, sometimes they just call you and say, I can't commit this to a piece of plastic. It just isn't going to work. So, and it's not that they don't want to do it, it's because they actually can't. Well, the equipment simply won't do it. So you've got to be very, very, very careful. Now, phasing is just something to be really, really careful with. It also manifests itself when you are recording, for example, if I've got lots of string parts, and I've got 3 parts per harmony part. So I've got like 3 Gs, and then 3 B flats, and then 3 Ds, or whatever chord you're playing. Every time you do a take on the same note, you should vary your position with the mic a little bit. Because if you're in the same place all the time, you do risk phase cancellations where the sounds are so similar that they can actually work against each other. You're much better off moving around the room a bit, or using 3 different mics with 3 different patterns, or in slightly different places perhaps. That might be the better bet, so that you can just record and not have to remember to move about, for example. So you have 3 mics and 3 different tracks for your 3 different takes of the same harmony part. Now, electric guitars, haven't really touched on those. I tend to boost between 2 and 4 kilohertz very slightly on any electric guitar track, just to give it a little bit of presence in the mix. And presence is actually a control that is on a guitar amp itself. You just turn that up and suddenly you can hear the thing just sort of rattle over the top of everything else. Compression is another thing that we've got to really touch on here. Now, if I just go back into the mixer, my vocals, when I play those back, you can see at the top, just get my mixer back, you can see at the top there's a tiny little bar there, and it shows how much the compressor is reducing the level by.
My friend, I said you call Dr. Robert.
What I want with that vocal part is for them to sit above the mix. Now imagine you've got your mix there, and you've got your maximum recording level there, but the vocals have a dynamic range of this. Quiet to loud. If the rest of the band is there, that means that any vocals that are underneath that level are just going to get lost in the mix. So what you do is you apply a compressor and then an overall volume gain, so that means the quietest bits of your vocals are on a par with the level of the overall mix. That's a really simplistic view of it, but actually sometimes simplistic views really do just bring everything to life. So, okay, so if I do this, once again, and with everything here, really, your ears are the ultimate judge. If you've got a really, really nice sounding mix that really stands up well on any audio system, the chances are you've pretty much done it right. Now, that's logic, and as you can see, there are lots and lots of ways of doing things. There are lots of things that you can do. Things like automation and all that sort of thing. Now, on GarageBand, I've got exactly the same tune here. So if I just play back a little bit of it. You can hear that one of my guitar parts is slightly out of alignment. What's happened there then? Oh yeah. That's the only problem with GarageBand, is that you can accidentally drag something if it's sort of out of alignment. But what I did was I exported all of the tracks from Logic, bypassing all the effect plugins, so everything was completely dry before bringing into GarageBand, because I wanted to use GarageBand's own EQs and own things to demonstrate. So I had a guitar amp there, actually. I got one of the guitar channels and put it on there instead. Now, let's just look at, let's see what this one is. Now, of course, I should have gone through and named my tracks as well. Let's have a look, see if I can find an overhead. What's this one? There we go. So, actually, that's my overheads combined there. Now, if I go into this track, I want to do my same thing again with my bass cut. So you can hear that there's a bass drum there, but there's a separate bass drum track. So all I do is go into the visual EQ and just do that, just cut off the bass. I may decide to increase the presence at the same time and maybe take out the extreme top end so it's not too fizzy. Perhaps. But that is just a brief foray into GarageBand's own EQ. Now you do have also on GarageBand, and this is really important, is that if I go into my effects again, if I click on one of the green pluses, go to audio unit extensions, I have a lot more fine control over things with these plugins here. Now, granted, they're not pretty pictures, but what you can do with them is really quite immense. If I go into, I don't know, low shelf filter, for example, let's have a look at that. Now, if I click on that, I get a rather boring box. Cut-off frequency, gain. That's essentially all you need for to cut all your bass off. So maybe if I go to 100 Hertz and 40 dB, that's huge. And what I really should do is demonstrate this on a track that doesn't need bass, because then you can hear the rumble that you might get.
Anyone in need.
There's a vocal part. Now, if I go into this now, plugins and EQ, and then I go to my audio unit extensions and low shelf filter, you'll hear what happens if I boost the very low bass on that vocal. Makes no difference to the vocal, but it sounds horrible otherwise because of all the bass rumble on it.
No one can succeed, Dr. Robert. Dr. Robert. Dr. Robert can succeed, Dr. Robert.
As you can hear, there is no difference between, really, any difference between having maximum bass on that vocal or minimum bass, but 40 dB is massive. Remember what I said about the halving of level is 6 dB, and the doubling is +6. So if you're doing -40, that's a huge reduction. And actually, the equalizer on Logic only allows -30, so -40 is massive and actually pretty useful if you've really got problems somewhere. Now, tackling compression on GarageBand, it's not a huge order. It's actually something that you can do pretty effectively. Now, we've got, at the moment, my lead vocal. I've just honed in on one of the vocals so that you can see, well, you can hear, rather, that you can't really hear it at all. Now, that's a combination of fairly low recording level and also there's no compression on it. Now, if I go into the plugins and EQ bit, and if I just up the slider rather on the compressor, suddenly it'll come out a bit better.
My friend works for the National Health, Dr. Robert.
That's all right. I can't hear all the bits of quiet vocals there, but it's a good start. If I go into plugins and EQ and compressor, I can then essentially go a bit further into it. Compressor threshold is the level at which that compressor kicks in. The lower down you set that setting, say -50, it'll affect pretty much the entire signal. We don't want that. We want there to be some dynamics there so that some of the louder bits are perhaps, the quieter bits rather, are untouched. But we want to bring up the overall gain. What we're doing with the compressor is we're bringing the top level down like that and then upping the overall result. That's what a compressor does. So ratio is the amount of compression above that threshold that it applies. And it's always expressed as a ratio, 6.8 to 1, all the way to 30 to 1, which is huge. 1 to 1 is no compression at all. So you have something like this.
My friend works for the National Health, Dr. Robert.
When I set the ratio higher, it means that the loud bits are going to get squashed more than the quiet bits. So if I set the threshold a bit lower, and just try it once again.
My friend works for the National Health, Dr. Robert.
I can hear everything there. Question is it still dynamic? Well, I don't know. It's a little bit much for me. But what you can also do to enable a vocal track to come out is to add a little bit of reverb.
The National Health Dr. Robert. You pay money just to see yourself done.
The reverb has given it a sort of a stereo image as well. Now, it's easier to pick out stuff in stereo than it is in mono. Mixing for mono is really hard because actually you've got to be listening to sort of strata as it goes back. This is kind of a throwback to the days of the 1930s where George Formby would be in some cinema, some sort of theatre somewhere recording a piece of music, and they'd stick the brass section at the back because they were louder and the double bass towards the front because it was virtually inaudible. And then of course you'd have the artist right next to the one microphone that existed in the theatre for making that recording. So there was a lot of pre-production had to be done. So there it is. There's a little bit about mixing and a bit of the sort of a bit about the traps not to fall into.